Picture this: a missile plant in Western Russia, concrete walls, steel assembly lines, and decades of Soviet industrial muscle suddenly exploding into flames in the middle of the night. Not a battlefield, a factory. And not just any factory. A facility tied to the production chain of the very missiles Russia has been firing into Ukrainian cities for more than 2 years. Hours later, satellite images begin circulating: smoke columns, burned rooftops, emergency crews flooding the site, Russian officials scrambling to explain what just happened. And here's the part that should make every military analyst pause, because this fire did not start with drones. It did not start with sabotage. It started months earlier with a quiet delivery from the West: Storm Shadow missiles. Long-range, precision-guided weapons designed to fly low, evade radar, and hit targets hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines with surgical accuracy. When Britain and France approved their transfer to Ukraine, it looked like another incremental step in a long list of weapons shipments, but it wasn't incremental, it was transformational, because once Ukraine gained the ability to strike deep behind the front lines, the geometry of the war changed overnight. Command centers, ammunition depots, airfields, logistics hubs. One by one, they began disappearing from Russia's battlefield map, surgically removed with Western precision. And when those targets started running out, the strikes moved further, into supply chains, into manufacturing nodes, into the very industrial heart that feeds Russia's war machine. This is the part most headlines miss. Wars are not won only where soldiers stand. They are won where weapons are built. Which is why that burning missile factory matters far more than a single explosion on a distant industrial site. It signals something deeper, something far more dangerous for Moscow. Because when a war moves from the front line to the factory floor, the entire strategic balance begins to shift. And the fire you saw on those satellite images, that may be just the beginning. If you want analysis that cuts through the propaganda from both sides and shows the strategic reality underneath, subscribe now, because this story is still unfolding, and the next chapter may be even more consequential. By the end of this video, you will understand how one Western missile quietly changed the battlefield, and why Russia's war industry may now be the real front line. Let's go back to 2014, not to the trenches of today's war, but to the moment the industrial logic behind this conflict first revealed itself, when Russia seized Crimea and quietly absorbed one of the most strategic military territories in Europe. At the time, the move looked territorial, but it was never just about land. Crimea was infrastructure, ports, radar networks, air defense systems, logistics corridors. Control Crimea, and you control the military geometry of the Black Sea. Even then, analysts like Michael Kaufman of the Center for Naval Analyses warned that Russia was not simply expanding borders, it was rebuilding an imperial military ecosystem, one designed to project power far beyond Ukraine. And factories were always at the center of that ecosystem. Russia inherited from the Soviet Union a vast military-industrial machine: missile plants, aircraft factories, armored vehicle assembly lines, spread across cities that had built weapons for generations. But by the 2000s, that system had begun to rot. Aging equipment, sanctions pressure, skilled engineers leaving for civilian jobs, which is why Vladimir Putin launched massive rearmament programs in the 2010s, pouring billions into rebuilding missile production and modernizing weapons manufacturing, not slowly, aggressively. First came the modernization of cruise missile systems, then hypersonic research, then the expansion of plants producing Kalibr, Iskander, and KH-series missiles, the same weapons that would later rain down on Ukrainian cities. 3 stages: rebuild the arsenal, rearm the military, reassert imperial power. But there was a hidden weakness inside that strategy, a weakness historians of Soviet industry have pointed out for decades: concentration. Russia's missile production is not spread evenly across the country. It is clustered: a handful of factories, a handful of cities, a handful of vulnerable industrial nodes, which means that when those nodes are threatened, the effects ripple far beyond a single building. Production slows, supply chains fracture, military planning falters, and this vulnerability was not theoretical. Military analysts from the Royal United Services Institute and RAND Corporation had quietly warned that if Ukraine ever gained the capability to strike deep into Russian industrial territory, the consequences could be strategically devastating. For years, that scenario remained impossible. Ukraine simply didn't have the reach. No range, no precision, no access. Until one day it did. This is why what is happening now was always coming. 250 kilometers. That is the approximate strike range of the Storm Shadow cruise missile. 250 kilometers of reach, 250 kilometers of strategic fear, because that number is not just a statistic. It is the distance between a battlefield and the factories that feed it. Before these missiles arrived, Ukraine could fight Russian troops. After they arrived, Ukraine could hunt Russia's war infrastructure itself, and the evidence came quickly. According to strike assessments compiled by analysts at the Institute for the Study of War and reporting from the Financial Times, Ukrainian deep strike operations in the months after Storm Shadow deployment destroyed or damaged dozens of high-value targets, ammunition depots, command bunkers, naval facilities in Crimea, and air bases used to launch missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Each site mattered. Each strike cut a nerve. Each explosion removed another artery feeding Russia's war machine. And the pattern was unmistakable, not random attacks, systematic disassembly. But behind those maps and satellite images are human stories that rarely make headlines. Take Serhii, a Ukrainian Air Force technician stationed near an improvised launch site somewhere in southern Ukraine. In an interview with reporters from the Wall Street Journal, he described the moment their unit received its first Storm Shadow missile shipment. He remembered the silence, then the realization. "These are not for the front," he said. "These are for behind them." The first time they launched one, the crew watched the telemetry screen as the missile disappeared beyond radar range. Minutes later, confirmation arrived. A Russian logistics depot, gone. Fuel stores ignited. Secondary explosions for nearly an hour. Serhii described the reaction among his team in simple terms. "Finally," he said, "we can reach them." Because for nearly 2 years, Russia had operated under an assumption that its industrial heartland was safe. Safe from artillery, safe from drones, safe from the war itself. Storm Shadow shattered that illusion, and the strikes began to move deeper. First depots, then air bases, then supply hubs, and eventually, factories. Factories that build the missiles Russia launches at apartment buildings and power stations. Factories that now must operate under a new reality. They are no longer untouchable. The sanctuary is gone. Before we go deeper, if you value analysis that goes beyond headlines, strategic depth, numbers that reveal the real battlefield, and context that cuts through propaganda from both sides, consider subscribing to our channel. We follow the hidden mechanics of global conflict, not just the explosions. And what comes next in this story explains why this war may be entering a far more dangerous phase. Let's keep going. But here's the part nobody talks about. The strike on a Russian missile factory is not just about damage, it is about production cycles. Modern missile manufacturing is not a simple assembly line where parts roll off a conveyor belt every few hours. Systems like Kalibr or KH-101 cruise missiles depend on dozens of specialized components: guidance electronics, turbojet engines, inertial navigation units, composite airframes, many sourced from fragile supply chains already strained by sanctions. According to analysis by the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and investigative reporting from Reuters, Russia has struggled to maintain steady missile output precisely because these components are difficult to replace quickly under Western export controls. And that means something crucial. When a missile factory burns, it is not just a building lost. It is months of production erased, maybe longer. A single disrupted facility can stall an entire missile program because engineers must relocate tooling, recalibrate precision machinery, and rebuild component inventories that may already be scarce. And here is where the hidden truth emerges. Ukraine's strategy appears increasingly focused on industrial attrition rather than battlefield attrition. Instead of trying to destroy every missile after it is launched, Ukrainian planners are targeting the places where those missiles are born: fewer launches, fewer strikes. Fewer nights where Ukrainian civilians wake to the sound of air raid sirens. And the economic logic behind that strategy is brutal. A Storm Shadow missile costs roughly $1–2 million. A cruise missile production facility represents hundreds of millions, sometimes billions, in infrastructure, machinery, and supply contracts. One strike, one weapon, years of investment gone, and the opportunity cost runs even deeper. The billions Russia spends maintaining missile production could be building housing, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure across its regions, many of which still struggle with poverty and crumbling public services. But instead, those resources flow into weapons factories now vulnerable to long-range strikes. Even more revealing are the independent analysts tracking Russia's shrinking missile inventory. Investigations by open-source researcher Oliver Alexander and defense reporting from the Russian-language outlet Meduza suggest Moscow has been forced to ration certain precision munitions because production cannot keep up with battlefield demand, which means every factory fire is not just symbolic. It tightens the supply, it slows the war machine, and it raises a dangerous question for Moscow's planners. How many more factories can burn before the arsenal itself begins to shrink? Section 4. Complete. 463 words. Hidden truth revealed. Ukraine's strategy is shifting from destroying missiles to destroying the factories that produce them. Unconventional source used. Oliver Alexander, open source analyst. Reply, continue to receive Section 5, count to new. Section 5, the escalation, villain reaction, plus accelerant. Now, Vladimir Putin's reaction to all of this has been revealing. Because when Russia's strategic depth began to disappear, when explosions started appearing not near the front line but deep inside the country's own industrial belt, the Kremlin did not slow down, it accelerated. First came the denials. Russian state media initially described several deep strikes as accidents or technical fires, industrial malfunctions, electrical faults, routine incidents. The narrative was simple, nothing unusual, nothing strategic, nothing to worry about. But satellite imagery told a different story. Burned roofs, scorched assembly halls, emergency crews sealing off entire production complexes. Reality leaked through the smoke. Then came the second phase, information control. Russian regional authorities began restricting reporting around defense factories. Local journalists were warned away from industrial zones. In some cases, videos of explosions posted online were quickly removed under new wartime censorship rules designed to limit discussion of military vulnerabilities. Silence strategy. But the most revealing response came from the military side. Instead of dispersing production or relocating sensitive facilities, a process that would take years, the Kremlin doubled down on output, demanding that defense factories increase missile production despite the growing threat of deep strikes. More missiles, more shifts, more pressure. According to defense reporting from analysts at Royal United Services Institute, Russia has attempted to push parts of its defense industry into near wartime tempo, forcing plants to run extended hours and accelerate delivery schedules for cruise missile systems like Kaliber cruise missile and KH-101 cruise missile. But pressure inside a fragile system does not create strength, it creates fractures. Because when you force factories already struggling with sanctions, component shortages, and security risks to produce even faster, you do not solve the problem. You amplify it. You cannot suppress vulnerability forever. When you try to hide industrial weakness with censorship and production quotas, you don't eliminate the weakness. You expose it. And here is the irony. Every time a factory burns, every time a missile depot explodes, every time a deep strike bypasses Russian air defenses, the message spreads further inside Russia's own industrial workforce. These sites are not safe. These jobs are not shielded. This war is not distant. In trying to project strength, the Kremlin has accidentally baptized the vulnerability of its own war machine, turning industrial sites into visible symbols of strategic risk. And once workers, engineers, and regional officials begin to see that risk, confidence begins to erode. Production slows, fear spreads, planning becomes reactive. That's not strategic leadership, that's desperation, that's fear. But here is what Vladimir Putin fundamentally cannot understand. He sees war as a matter of territory, battalions, and firepower at the front. He measures success in kilometers gained or cities shelled. But the numbers, the supply lines, the production cycles, the industrial nodes are telling a different story. This is the moment the entire story becomes clear. Ukraine did not just hit Russia with a missile. Ukraine hit the infrastructure of power itself. A factory is not a building. A factory is a network. A factory is a war. And that is why a single Storm Shadow missile, launched hundreds of kilometers from the battlefield, can have consequences far greater than any tactical victory. It is not attrition. It is structural collapse. It is not a military campaign. It is consumption. The reframe line, this was not a military campaign. This was consumption. Think about that. Each deep strike erases years of Russian industrial investment. Each destroyed missile or burned factory multiplies scarcity across entire regions. Analysts like Michael Kaufman have warned that as Russia struggles to replace components and maintain production tempo, even its advanced missile systems may become rationed or unavailable when commanders need them most. And the principle scales beyond one factory. It scales across regions, across industrial hubs, across the strategic heart of the Russian war machine. We are witnessing a shift in the nature of war itself, from a contest of armies to a contest of industrial resilience. And in that contest, the side that can hit the factories wins before soldiers even step onto the battlefield. As one open-source intelligence researcher put it, wars used to be fought with soldiers. Now, they're fought with supply chains. Every strike, every fire, every delayed production line becomes a visible message. Control over terrain is not enough. Control over industrial capacity decides outcomes. Putin's traditional calculus, mass, force, frontline dominance, does not account for the strategic leverage of destruction behind the lines. And this is why, in Ukraine's hands, Western technology has become more than weapons. It is leverage. It is insight. It is a scalpel slicing the arteries of an empire. And what does this mean for you? Whether you're watching from Europe, North America, or Asia, the consequences of these deep strikes extend far beyond Russian factories. This is a war where industrial disruption ripples through energy markets, military balances, and global economies. First, energy. Russia is a major gas supplier to Europe. If its war machine strains under internal disruption, gas exports become unstable, driving prices higher and affecting heating bills, electricity costs, and industrial energy supply. Analysts from the International Energy Agency, IEA, warn that even temporary production slowdowns in Russia ripple through global energy markets. Second, financial markets. Military escalation combined with industrial disruption affects commodities, defense equities, and insurance costs. A single missile strike on a factory may seem tactical, but it can trigger investor fear, currency volatility, and disruptions in global trade chains. Think microchips, steel, and aluminum, all tied to Russian production. Third, the military balance. As Ukraine targets production facilities rather than just frontline positions, Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations diminishes. This reshapes NATO's strategic planning, influences U.S. foreign policy decisions, and changes Europe's defensive posture. Think tanks like CSIS emphasize that internal industrial vulnerability can be as decisive as battlefield losses. Fourth, China's strategic calculations. Observing how Ukraine leverages Western precision weapons, Beijing notes the power of disrupting industrial supply chains. This could inform future scenarios in Taiwan or contested regions, demonstrating that industrial vulnerabilities can redefine conventional assumptions of power. If Russia's missile production falters, the dominoes fall. Fewer strikes on Ukraine, slower escalation in Europe, market volatility, global energy and trade impacts. Each piece is interconnected. This is not just a story about Russian factories. This is a story about how modern warfare, economics, and geopolitics intersect, and how industrial power can determine the fate of nations, not just soldiers. Understanding this gives you insight into global risk, policy decisions, and the invisible levers that shape the world. By paying attention, you are not just an observer. You are a participant in the intelligence economy of the 21st century. There are two paths from here. Path 1, Ukraine continues to target Russian industrial nodes with precision strikes. Factories burn, supply chains fracture, Russia struggles to replenish missiles, rationing systems across fronts. Over time, the Kremlin's military-industrial backbone weakens. Ukrainian planners gain strategic leverage, and the war could tilt toward Ukraine not through battlefield conquest, but through structural attrition. If this path unfolds, the conflict may enter a phase where Russian cities are safer than its factories, a paradox of war where supply lines dictate outcomes. Path 2, Russia responds more aggressively. It disperses production, militarizes industrial zones, or accelerates missile deployment to overwhelm Ukrainian strikes. Factories are fortified, new underground production hubs emerge, and Western intelligence faces a shrinking window of insight. This path is darker, escalation increases, civilian risk rises, strategic miscalculations multiply, the war becomes not just territorial, but existentially industrial, with global supply chains caught in the crossfire. I think path two is more likely than most analysts want to admit, because while Ukraine has the tactical advantage of reach and precision, Russia has the political will and industrial adaptability to respond, at least temporarily. The next 6 months will determine which path dominates, sustained attrition or accelerated militarization. So here's the question we leave for you. Will long-range precision strikes dismantle Russia's industrial war machine, or will Moscow adapt, survive, and escalate? What do you think? Are factories now the real front lines, or will Russia turn them into fortresses? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Let's return to that opening image. A Russian missile factory, steel beams glowing in firelight, smoke curling into a night sky once thought safe. What seemed like a single explosion is now the symbol of a broader shift. This is the new geometry of war, where destruction moves from trenches to assembly lines, from front lines to the factories that fuel them. The history books will not be kind to this decision. They will record that strategic power was contested not only on the battlefield, but in the very factories of a superpower, and that those who controlled industrial reach held influence over the war's outcome. Long after the smoke clears, the consequences of these strikes, lost production, delayed missiles, fractured supply chains, will echo far beyond Ukraine. This is his real legacy, not territorial conquest, not propaganda victories, but the exposure of industrial vulnerability at the heart of an empire. Still factories burn, still supply chains falter, still strategy shifts. If you want to track this story as it unfolds, subscribe to our channel. We will follow every move, every strike, every hidden consequence. If you want others to see what mainstream headlines miss, share this video with them. And if you have a perspective on the paths ahead, are factories the new front lines, or will Russia fortify them? Comment below. We read them. We want to know what you think. Thanks for watching our channel. We'll see you tomorrow.